I am here with Mac, who is the host of the YouTube show Good Politic Guy. Also, recently been doing some on the ground reporting for Breaking Points in the wake of, Palestinian support in Washington D.C. Before we get into some of the things I just wanted to ask you about to get a get a consensus from somebody that talks about this, daily, for people that maybe are less politically inclined. Uh, how have you dealt with? How have you been doing with talking about this endlessly, needing to be up to date on everything? What have there been things as you're going through this that keep you kind of going with the public reaction? Just kind of speak to a little bit with how you've been handling talking about this horrific situation and constantly needing to be
Yeah,
updated.
dude. I mean, it's it's obviously tough because it's kind of part of my job to stay on top of these things as aggressively as I possibly can. And you do end up seeing a lot of horrific images coming out from on the ground. You see a lot of unfortunately, like dead innocent men, women, and children. And it's especially difficult, I think, when you do see such an uproar from the American people. You can look at the polling data. It's a majority of Democrats, it's a majority of Republicans and independents who all want a ceasefire right now. You see the massive protests like the one that I was at, where I was talking to people on the street, and there's just a massive contradiction there with what's happening in Washington D.C. politics, where I mean, we literally only have a handful of representatives who have the the guts to come out and call for even just a ceasefire, let alone to address the underlying issues that are at play with Israel and with Palestinian liberation. And so, it's obviously a very difficult thing, but at the same time, seeing people protesting, seeing people take action, seeing people educate themselves on this topic in such a tense and heated moment like this, and in a lot of ways, like risking their jobs, risking relationships and stuff to speak out on this. I think that gives me motivation to keep going and to stay on top of it, because it's an important issue, and especially if you're an American, it's a doubly important issue, because it's not just that this is something that's happening in some faraway country that we have no connection to. Like, we are active participants in this. Our government is helping to fund this. Our government is helping to arm the Israeli side of this equation. And so I think it's even more important to use this as a moment to get involved in one way or another.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to bring up, and something I've been trying to say to people when I talk to them daily or just through online forums or whatever else, that like, people try to equate things in the situation between Hamas and Israel with the violent attacks between both sides, which also just numbers wise is absolutely
Right.
ridiculous, right? I'm not, again, also to be, just to make sure everyone's clear, like, no one here is saying Hamas is a good organization, that violence against civilians is great. It's all horrific. But I think a lot of people lose in the weeds of propaganda, in the weeds of cable news, if that's what they consume more of. That like, our tax dollars aren't going to bombs that are sent to Israel. Our tax dollar, I mean,
To
are
Hamas, yeah.
they are going to Israel. They're not going to, they're
Right.
not going to Hamas. They're not going to, like, the discrepancy in our involvement is blatantly obvious, right? And I think that's something that people need to focus on when you're in the United States, Canada, the UK, a lot of different Western democracies, is that not only is the violence very one-sided in overall numbers and civilian percentage casualties, right? Even between the horrific violence on October 7th, to what Israel's doing in Gaza, even the percentages of civilians that are killed is astronomically different, right? On top of, like I said, billions of dollars of weaponry and funding and Iron Dome and everything else. It is good to hear, and I felt the same way. So I live in rural Illinois. I drove out to Chicago for the protest in early or late October, where we had over 25,000 people. It was more people than it showed up even in the Black Lives Matter protests. You were at the one in DC, which, cable news tried to say was 40,000 people, which I thought was pretty laughable. But we can also get into why they try to downplay these things so much. But it is good to see, or something, when you care about these things, just care about civilian lives, that public support
Yeah.
is there, right? Like, I know from your show, something that I followed your show more than a lot of other people's when it comes to keeping up to date with this stuff. That vast majority of Democrats, independents, and even Republicans want a ceasefire. So, another question I had for you. You've covered this a little bit on your show in relation to that, but what do you think is different about this time in relation to what I would say was the last big war propaganda buildup, which was, post 9/11. What do you think is the difference here between then, with how the propaganda hit? I think it was very effective with what they were setting up, for better or for worse. And why is that not taking hold now through, whether it's the government or, cable news apparatus, whatever? Why is their messaging just not landing with people the way
You
it
know,
did
it's a
before?
good question. I did an interview with Jordan Ewell from the Insurgents podcast yesterday, and we were kind of talking about that a little bit. I think it has a lot to do with just the information space right now, with so much social media activity and different avenues for information that young people disproportionately have access to. And you do kind of see a generational divide as well on this kind of a thing, where young people skew much more in terms of support, solidarity with the Palestinian side of this. Older people tend to be much more pro-Israel, and there's a whole history behind why that may be the case. But I think a large part of it is definitely that we have platforms like Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, whatever the case may be, and it's not just that we get different kinds of information than what you would see sort of filtered through a corporate media mouthpiece, but we get to directly see what's happening on the ground, like in real time. I mean, I can't even tell you how many different videos I've seen that are like, testimonies directly from doctors, for example, recently in Al-Shifa Hospital, the largest hospital in Gaza, and them describing how they're currently being bombed. I just saw there's a recent update where, unfortunately, a couple of the doctors who worked in Al-Shifa that's currently being raided essentially by the Israelis were bombed in their house that was right next to the hospital. And you get to see, I think, a lot of those very personalized testimonies. You do, unfortunately, again, have to see like a lot of the carnage on the ground. But I think that's something maybe we did like further on during the Iraq-Afghanistan wars, but like it's so much more prevalent right now, where you can't really avoid seeing the carnage on the ground. And so I think that just kind of weighs on people. Like, after October 7th, which I obviously agree with you, that was a horrific attack. There are many innocent civilians who were killed during that. And I think that there was an opportunity there for there to be like a big push for sympathy and understanding and all of that for the Israelis. But then when they immediately turn around and just ramp it up and escalate it to the point that we're seeing right now, I mean, the statistics of what's happening on the ground are just like mind blowing. I mean, we've seen a majority of the housing in Gaza has been either fully or partially destroyed. Obviously people don't have access to reliable water or food or internet or any of that stuff. The casualty numbers are absolutely through the roof. The last time I saw it was over 11,000 total, with 4,500 of them being children. And we see that, young people especially see that coming across our feeds in a constant flow. And so it's kind of hard to avoid, unless unless you just have like no empathy, unless you have no heart. I think that it's kind of hard to avoid showing sympathy in that kind of a situation.
Yeah, 100%. And just to give the context, again, this article I have pulled up here is from Friday. So unfortunately, these numbers are probably higher than what you and I are both talking about. But from from a news source in the Middle East, they talked about that 11,078 confirmed civilians are dead, and over 4,500 are children. And I guess like for me, what's been the most unsettling at this point is, obviously, aside from the actual horrific nature of this and what I think objectively can be called a genocide and an ethnic cleansing and an ongoing apartheid, right? Um, just the total disparity between what a lot of us, even people that are maybe less quote unquote left wing than you or I, but are able to be engaged with more independent news sources, or as you said, through social media, for better or for worse, that just even the most progressive, not all, right? There's a handful of progressive lawmakers that have really spoken out. Rashida Tlaib being the most vocal voice, and really showing how much integrity she has in a lot of ways. Um, how a vast majority of people like Bernie Sanders are like the worst that I've seen, which we shouldn't be surprised at as much as John Fetterman, but even to that point,
Yeah.
it's been absolutely disgusting. Or the video came out that I think Jordan Ewell shared, that you just mentioned was on your show, has been on the show before, that um, uh, of Elizabeth Warren being confronted by somebody that had over 60
Right.
members of their family die and basically getting shuttered out, and Elizabeth Warren saying like, this isn't the right place to talk about this kind of deal, right? I think that's been like the second most disheartening thing to the actual situation, is that like the quote unquote electoral left has really shown its full, to be blunt, shown its full ass on imperialism here. And Joe Biden, obviously, who is not a progressive but is the head of the Democratic Party, um, really saying things like straightforward, there is no room for a ceasefire. At one point, they called it repugnant. Um, Obviously, they've talked about little things anecdotally, but all in all, are effectively in the same boat as Republicans on this. Just like use rhetoric to be a little more like sanitizing of the situation. Um, do you see, because you're a person, other left-wing people that are kind of in that circle, whether it's Secular Talk or the Crystal Kyle and Friends podcast, Breaking Points, which you work for. There's been some of you, and I can see it and have agreed with it to some extent. In 2020 I voted for Joe Biden for a lesser of two evils kind of deal, but almost all of you in unison have been like, I don't really see at this point how I can sit here and say, vote for this guy. It's worth voting for him over
Yeah.
Trump, right? Like, and that doesn't mean that you equate the two, that they are in any means like the same, but at the same time, when it comes to genocide and imperialism and foreign policy, I think Joe Biden, the Biden administration, are really showing what that there are no differences for some of us that really care about these policies or care about these situations, regardless of electoralism. Um, that there's not enough distinction, and you're not really showing your voters why they should vote for them. So I guess after my little rambling there, do you think in this situation there is a way for Biden to turn around and do a correct policy change on Israel? Do you see this as just continuing on the way it's going with the rhetoric that they have? What's your consensus with between the public pressure and the kind of line the Democrats have drawn here in the sand of this? Where do you see that going forward, I
I
guess?
mean, I think that there definitely is a way that Joe Biden could course correct here. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious. The calls for a ceasefire couldn't possibly be louder. So, I mean, it wouldn't undo the damage that's been done. Obviously, it won't bring people back to life. It won't, restore the infrastructure of Gaza. It won't solve any of the underlying problems that still exist. But that would be like immediate step to try to win back some sort of goodwill with, progressives or leftists or, people in the Arab American community who have turned against Biden, I think for good reason. There are definitely things that he can do. The question of whether or not he's going to do that, I don't see that happening. I mean, I would love to think that we can continue to apply pressure, we can continue to protest, we can continue to do all these things, and I think it does make a difference, right? Because I don't think that they would even be bothering to call for a humanitarian pause or to get more aid into Gaza. I don't think they would even be rhetorically doing the things or saying the things that they're saying right now about how much they care about innocent civilians, which we know that they really don't. But I don't think that they would even be taking that minimal step if they weren't feeling the public pressure. And so I do think it's meaningful, and maybe it can get to a point where it's so overwhelming that maybe not with Joe Biden, but, with other members of Congress, with other Democrats or whatever the case may be, where they just hear so much backlash to their current line, their current position, that it ends up, causing some sort of a sea change. But what I think is probably going to happen, I think that Israel is going to continue with their invasion. I think they are essentially going to continue to raise the north of Gaza to the ground. I think there is going to be a long-term occupation of the Gaza Strip. I think that there are going to probably be upwards of like 1.5 to 2 million Gazans who are displaced as a result of that. You can call that ethnic cleansing. You can call it, by a number of different terms. But, I think that's probably going to be an outcome. And what we're seeing right now, over the last couple of days or even the last day is a massive escalation with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And so then you have the prospects of this spiraling into an even broader war where you have Iranian backed proxies who are then, going tit for tat, escalating with Israel in the north of Israel, which could then open up a two front war, which then makes the situation even worse, which could then lead to the United States getting even more directly involved in it. So, it's a couple of different questions there. What do I hope could happen? What do I think could happen versus what do I think will happen?
Yeah.
And honestly, where we're at right now, I think probably the worst case scenario is the direction that we're heading. So, it's doomer, it's unfortunate, but that's just kind of what the lay of the land looks like.
Well, and I appreciate you being realistic, being realistic on that, because I am trying myself to have what, some of my more like socialist, communist friends or people in organizations like to call revolutionary optimism on some things like this, right? But boy, it feels difficult. But I think the thing to come away from, and I watched your conversation with Jordan Yule as well before doing this. I think both of you said a great point of like, it's important to look at why sending things like through the ceasefiretoday.com website or Gaza Strong for people that might not be in the United States, Canada, or the UK, why it is important to do that. Because while we know that politicians don't work for the people, right? That's pretty old news for
Yeah.
about anybody that's in this country for quite some time. That the fact that they look at those numbers, the fact that they really do see the disparity in the amount of emails and calls and everything in between that they get between people that are calling for a ceasefire, calling for an end to occupation, calling for whatever range of pro-Palestinian or just
Right.
pro-peace, basically, as compared to being like on the Israel hardline. It can make a difference, right? I don't think some of the, like I said, I live in Illinois. Dick Durbin, anecdotally, now he didn't vote for this or anything like that, but he was the first senator that at least publicly said there should be um,
Right.
lines for a ceasefire at this point. And I am in no disillusion or no notice that he is
Right.
some progressive, anti-war Democrat, but I do know that through that website, which I use daily, just like on my break time or on my way home from work, that's how easy it can be. Or other people that I've talked to that in other circumstances are relatively apolitical. I'm sure thousands and thousands of emails and hundreds of calls made him feel like if I don't do this, maybe less people show up to vote for me or whatever else, right? So I think it is important to remind ourselves in these bleak situations where it really does feel like the administration's not going to do anything
Yeah.
to stop this or to hinder it or whatever else, that public pressure does work. So I guess speaking to that, I know we talked about the protests a little bit earlier, but I don't want to take too much more of your time on this here. We'll do a few more minutes, a few more questions here, but I wonder, like, what were some of the takeaways you had? Because I know for Breaking Points, you talked specifically to a number of different people from a variety of backgrounds, from a variety of ages. What were some of the points that you got from those people, kind of the insight from being there that give you a little, to not be totally doomer on this, like you said earlier, that give you a little bit of hope, a little bit of optimism for the future with
Yeah, I
this
mean,
conflict?
I don't want to be totally doomer on it. I do legitimately believe that we can make a difference if there's enough overwhelming pressure. I think it's more just a question of how and when do you get to that point? And so I do, I don't want to make it seem like I'm nihilistic about this. I am optimistic in some sense. So,
Of course.
in terms of the protests that I went to, I think probably the main just sort of underlying thing that stuck out to me was that you did have such a wide array of people there, right? It wasn't just people who have family members in Gaza. I was
Right.
talking to people who, some of them did have family members in Gaza. Some of them were from, had family members in other surrounding countries in the region. But then some of them were also Jewish. Some of them had lived in Israel. Some of them were just regular old Americans who have no connection whatsoever to Israel or to Gaza. And so I think that was sort of the main thing that stood out to me is this intersectionality, this cross sectioning of people from all different walks of life, all different religions and ethnicities, and all of the above, coming together for a common cause. And so I think that does give me a lot of optimism, because it's, it can be difficult sometimes, but at the same time, it's not very difficult to stand on the right side of history. And I think a lot of people realize that. And I think a lot of people are, starting to learn a lot more about this and learn a lot more about the history of it. And, that does give me optimism to see so many different kinds of people coming together under one banner, to try to call for what's right. So, there's a little bit of hopium, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's what we need to find in these times to kind of keep going. I think a little bit, right? Because it's good to see that. Like I was the same way, in Chicago, just being on the ground, seeing little kids marching. There was one thing that like I have a video of it that I haven't like posted online because as a
Yeah.
kid, so I just I don't know how I feel about that. But of this little kid with a bullhorn, must have been 10 years old, just like
I think I
screaming for
saw that. I think I
Palestinian
saw that online.
liberation and
Yeah.
thousands. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Or like there's like 12-year-old kids standing on top of like these
Yeah.
bus stop areas holding signs and keeping chants going and all this kind of stuff. And like there's just something about that to me that like despite all the horrificness we can see, to quote a conservative politician, you can really see Israel turning it into a parking lot in Gaza at moments and everything else. It's good to see like uh optimism and defiance in like a constructive way that is like you said, just on the right side of history. There's nothing aggressive about it in a lot of sense. There's just defiance to the narrative and defiance
Right.
to war, which is just a beautiful thing to see. The last thing I kind of wanted to go over with you here, again, it comes back to American politics because I really do feel like talking about it in that lens is something that people really need um, to wrestle with. Is kind of the I think the misnomer that a lot of us post Biden pulling out of Afghanistan, and what some people called a push down or like a big retraction of the drone striking and everything else, and how it relates now with Israel and Gaza, about this idea that a lot of us had of the Biden administration. I mean, I think we're probably a little more wise than this, but the Biden administration being sort of more on the cusp of like teetering down war, teetering down conflicts. When I was reading through before we were going to do this the other day, um, that there was a lot of this push from MSNBC or even independent news outlets about Biden sort of bringing down the drone war. But like when you look into things like Just Security, which I think is a good site to kind of look at and break down some of these things, about how he's really been just pulled it back to the Obama era and also kept in the lack of transparency in drone operations that Trump put in place in the first place. Um, I guess this is a little less specific to the Israel Gaza war. I mean, calling it a war is a little bit of a double speak, but you know what I'm saying. But like I guess with in relation to the Biden administration in general, both when it comes to war, when it comes to the border, when it comes to a lot of different things that they really ran on, to be, to say that they were going to change a lot of these policies that Trump had in place that were horrific, right? In a lot of different senses. Um, do I guess do you see uh, do you see this moment of Israel and Gaza kind of being the indictment on a lot of that, and the fact that um, I mean, I think toe to toe effectively, other than anecdotes and messaging, that in a lot of these different instances that they're really keeping the same policies that Trump had, wanting people to look at this as if they're doing something different or they're just helping out with self-defense or different things in that scenario. I guess like what do you think this is sort of an indictment on the Democratic Party as far as the establishment goes and presidential candidates, of showing that they're really not up to the task of of listening to their constituents what they want, and do you think this is kind of leading to the point that that a lot of people leave the Democratic Party, and we're in real trouble in 2024 for a
Yeah.
Republican. Like, I guess that's kind
No,
of a
I got
jumbled,
you. Yeah.
jumbled question, but you
Yeah,
kind of get
no,
what
I
I'm
think
saying with
that
that.
I think this is definitely going to screw Democrats in 2024. I mean, it already wasn't looking too good, especially with Joe Manchin retiring. They basically have to do like a clean sweep of a lot of these other very close Senate races in 2024 to keep the Senate. So that's already going to be difficult. At the top of the ticket with Joe Biden, I'd probably put it at like a 60-40 chance that Trump wins, unless he like literally ends up behind, jail bars before that. Um,
And who
Right,
knows if that'll
right.
make a
Or you know
difference,
what?
right?
Either of them could just like randomly drop dead at any point. So that could also happen, and shake things up.
Fingers. I mean, I'm just
Well, that
kidding.
might be
Yeah,
the,
yeah,
that
but
might
yeah.
unfortunately be the best case scenarios if both of them just sort of, but yeah, anyways, I think that, it is very revealing to see this, to see it in such a bipartisan way with such a bipartisan consensus. I don't want to pretend as if Republicans are better in any way, shape, or form on this kind of an issue, because they're certainly not. If anything,
Right.
they're more psychotic and absolutely bloodthirsty on this kind of a thing. I don't know if you watched the Republican primary debate, but we basically had some of these guys. We had
Oh,
them call for war with probably 6 different countries. It was like China, Mexico, Iran,
yeah.
a bunch of different countries. So
It was like
right,
they were
right,
drooling at the thought of just like mass war. Like, bro,
yeah,
like what are you doing? Like, who are
exactly.
you talking to?
Um,
Yeah, sorry. Go
yeah,
ahead.
so I mean, like
Yeah.
it's not as if Republicans are better, but at the same time, with Joe Biden doing this and showing the American people what kind of a side he's on in this kind of a situation, he does leave a window open there for a sort of fake pseudo populist outsider, if you want to call him an outsider, even though he's not, like Donald Trump, to step in and be like, well, look, I didn't start any wars during my presidency and the world was in peace. Look at Joe Biden. He caused the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza and whatever, whatever, whatever. And so even though Trump is worse on all of those different measures and he's more hawkish in a lot of ways, it gives some populist, I guess, Republicans a window of opportunity there to posture against the pro-war stance of the US empire as a whole, Democrats and Republicans, even when they're not. And I mean, that's kind of like the bleakest part of all of this, is that you have such a willingness, such a demand overwhelmingly from the American people that we do not want to get into forever wars like this. Please don't get us into a goddamn war with Iran right now. Like you did a poll with the American people. Do you want to go do preemptive strikes on Iran? It would be polling at probably 5%. Okay, so I mean, there's such an energy there that is anti-war, that wants the US government to actually focus on things that uplift people on the bottom rung of the ladder in this country. And so it's really like just deeply, deeply unfortunate to see what is supposed to be the left-wing party in this country posture in this kind of a way. And it's not even as if it helps electorally, which is also a very dark part about this, right? It would be one thing if, okay, the American people overwhelmingly are on one side of this issue, and this is going to secure Joe Biden the 2024 election. It's not. If anything, this is going to cost him the 2024 election. So you're not only morally wrong and morally bankrupt, but you're also not even helping yourself electorally. So it's a shit show from top to bottom.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it just does show to people that are invested in politics but have largely been into electoral politics that there are just a lot more things to do in this moment than be, a Democrat or Republican or even pushing for a third party. That public pressure, joining an organization, going to protests, um, and even just educating people in your community, unionizing. I mean, that sounds like that's even talking about unionization sounds like it has nothing to do with this, but just in general, the more people can have a mass movement, coalition in various parts of the political process, I think this moment, along with obviously what's been going on with unionization in a different way with like the UAW and everything else like that, really just does go to show that there is a lot more you can do if you feel completely disillusioned from both political parties than just voting for the lesser of two evils or becoming apathetic and sitting out, right? So I guess on that point, I guess I said a few things there, but other than in this moment when people feel disillusioned, and we'll leave it at this, and then I'll just have you plug where people can follow you. Um, what do you think? What are some things, some avenues people that hear about this really feel disillusioned, like I said, from politics, from the disparity of knowing what our money is going to through taxes, everything in between. What are some things people can do to help to put public pressure on and to really try to make a difference in a mass movement in the context of
Yeah, I mean,
Israel and Gaza?
I talked about this earlier in my interview, but Jordan, you will put together a great set of resources that I think are a good first step for anybody who's trying to get more involved. I believe the website is ceasefiretoday.com. So that gives you, I mean, it gives you a way to contact your representative, to call your member of Congress. It gives you a script on what to say to them. Protests near you, donation sites that you can go to, like the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund. It gives a bunch of different resources just in that one avenue that I think could be helpful for people who like don't have a bunch of time to get into like direct action or organizing necessarily. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a great resource there. I think also just making your voice heard. I know it's very difficult because there's so much pressure on a lot of people, and a lot of people feel as though they could lose their job, or they could be ostracized in one way or another. And that I don't want to pretend like that threat isn't there, but all I can say is that I think 10 years from now, when you look back at a moment like this, you will not regret standing on the right side of history and speaking out on it. And so yeah, I mean, beyond that, I think just organizing, look around for your local, whatever it may be, DSA or something like that. If you're at a college, then join your local student organizations and things like that. And I think just getting mobilized, just getting educated, getting more involved in any way that you can is going to put, it doesn't need to make a change overnight, but if collectively we can all apply some sort of a modicum of pressure in the right direction, then I do think it makes a difference.
100%. And to that point, real quick before we go, and I just have you plug where people can follow your work and what you do. I I think I mentioned to you in a message, and I've said to some other people, I've been pretty outspoken about this, and I work a everyday job. I'm a teacher, right? And I've had a couple of people, that have come forward and threatened my job. Right now, I know they're little fucking bitches,
Right.
so they're not going to do it, right? But like, I think it's important. When I was in that moment, just as anecdotally as some day man, whatever, and I got a little freaked out. I try to just keep things in context. That it's like, is that scary? Yeah. Is that put a lot of pressure on you to not say something? Yes. But what's important to remember is what's actually going on in a place that our tax dollars are going to, and just like the bombardment and horrific nature of what's going on. And if, like, at the end of the day, 90% of the time, these people are not going to actually go after your job. But if they do, there are communities out there that will
Right.
help you get your feet back into place. There's other jobs out there. And not to say that that's what we
Yeah.
want to happen, but what I'm saying is the disparity between the two, um, I guess, like you said, it's important to think about where you are on the right side of history, and it's important to think about what you're trying to stop and how many lives are at stake. So, on that note, I think it's important to kind of keep those things in mind when talking about this. Like, if people are a little apprehensive, don't be apprehensive. Talk about it. There's communities out there that will help you if something comes up. If, like, establishment cancel culture, for lack of a better word, comes after you, just remember what's important. Remember what the right thing is to do. And on that note, Matt, thanks so much for your time out of your busy schedule. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the work that you do. Go ahead and just plug where people can find you, where people can find your work,
Yeah,
and
for
we'll
sure. I appreciate you having me on. I think it's always good. Our conversations are good. So, yeah, thanks for having me on. My name is Mac. I go by Good Politic Guy. You can find me on YouTube, Twitter, Twitch sometimes, rarely, but yeah, that's basically the gist of it.
absolutely. And I really recommend, again, I think you were the fifth episode
Really.
on the show almost a year ago now at this point. Yeah, we're getting on 40, I think, now. But just Mac is a great person to follow. That's level-headed. Also covers news and politics in a way that you won't find from mainstream media, and I think is kind of a more objective resource if you want to hear about topics, whether it's economics, unionization, or in this case, Israel and Gaza. Great person to follow. So again, thanks so much, Mac, for your time, and appreciate what you do.
Appreciate it, man. Thank you.